Aloha mai kako. Welcome to the Māpuna Lab. I'm Kat Burke, principal investigator of this project, and I wanted to begin by sharing our mission and vision. Hoʻi ka ʻōʻopu ai lehua I ka māpunapuna, the lehua-eating golby returns to the spring, instead of one who has gone back to the source. The Māpuna Lab is guided by the ʻōhiʻa lehua, Metrosideros polymorpha, an endemic Hawaiian tree, our teacher, in healing the chronic and existential pain of historical and intergenerational trauma. Viewing the land as our communities and our health as the water cycle resilience, this series looks to the cloud-catching, truth-telling ʻōhiʻa lehua for ways to hoʻi kawai, to remove seen and unseen emotional blockages, to restore waters, waiwai, stolen by trauma. Aimed at creating safe spaces for co-learning, the Māpuna Lab convenes all those who believe that when Indigenous leadership is uplifted, wellness is accessible to all. This web series is sponsored by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention through contract with the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Division of the Behavioral Health Administration of the State Department of Health in affiliation with the Hawaii Opioid Initiative. In this series, our task is to develop and infuse professional training for providers, clinicians, and cultural practitioners that provides culturally relevant connection to mental health and substance use disorder support services in response to disaster relief, specific to Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. In this capacity, we're guided by the workforce development recommendations of the National Class Standards, Papaʻololokahi's Eola Moa Mo, and our own school that teaches future social workers to engage, honor, and respect Indigenous culture towards decolonized professional practice. Over the past year, we've been really fortunate to learn the application of Pilahi Paki's Aloha Spirit law with our colleagues from the state, from her haumana in Pono Shim. We invite everyone to join us in the Aloha response to disaster, to our presentation today, and to one another. In looking at the data on disaster response, we began with statewide emergency proclamations since 2018. What we found is that although when we think of about like natural disaster in Hawaii, we may think about volcanic activity. We saw that other issues such as invasive species like the axis deer and the overwhelming majority of proclamations related to COVID-19 were the focus. So apart from the pandemic, the majority of natural disasters are actually related to hurricanes, heavy rains, and the flooding that results. And we currently have a strong emergency response system for flooding in Hawaiʻi, the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency. At that link there on the slide, you can see a map that's searchable by address to identify whether or not you live or work or play in an evacuation zone. Here we see in Hawaiʻi on the east side of Oahu, the tsunami evacuation zone in red and the extreme tsunami evacuation zone in yellow. Oh, let's go back one more, mahalo. And the safe zone in green, which is towards the Ko'ola Mountains. In this series, we present a culturally anchored approach to mitigating the mental health impacts of surviving natural disaster by flipping that script a little bit. While we have been taught to believe in heavy rain as a disaster, Hawaiian epistemology teaches ola I kawai a ka'aupua, there is life in the water from the clouds. Rain gives us life. And when we visit Hawaiʻi, as many of you I'm hoping have, we can see the decades of work that's been done by community-based organizations like Kako'oiwi, Paipai o Hawaiʻi, Papahana Kuo'ola, and Hui Kumauliola to remove invasive species, replant natives, cultivate taro from the water that flows so it can feed the fish pond below. If you look closely, you might see an ʻalai ula there by the foamy discharge coming from the rain from this morning. So if you can maybe see like a red beak, that's the ʻalai ula. And so when we say when Indigenous leadership is uplifted, wellness is accessible to all, we mean all, including all the plants, including all the native birds, including all the entities that our ecosystem supports and that need waiwai in order to thrive. So mahalo for joining us today to learn along with us how to remember disaster as opportunities to thrive. And next, I'd like to call on Kea to introduce herself and tell us more about the training. Mahalo.
Mahalo, Kat. Aloha mai kako. I'm Kea Li'ipo'oloa, and I'm the project manager and cultural advisor for the Māpuna Lab. When we first came together to discuss the idea of creating a cultural workforce training in relation to disaster, we decided to bring together our stories. And so Inocenta Soundkikyu, we're very blessed is with us today, Kat and Ku'ule and I would gather every Thursday morning to share mo'olelo, exchange mana'o, to laugh and cry. And through this sharing, we created the foundation that became our framework. We've been incredibly blessed to have Inocenta as our spiritual guide and our leader on community navigation. She shared several stories that inspired our ʻUlu as disaster response framework. The first story she shared was how they would carve a canoe out of the trunk of an ʻUlu tree and sail that canoe to other islands, where sometimes that canoe would be planted as a stick seed and take root to grow ʻUlu as food. I was skeptical at first as how a saltwater logged tree trunk can take root, but she says can, and you don't argue with Mama Ino. But it was the metaphor of the canoe sailing to other islands to become a source of food, thus a source of life, that struck me as particularly significant in the way that we as Oceania people thrive on tiny islands in the middle of the largest ocean on the planet. And it's that ocean that connects us to each other. In Hawaii, we have a saying, he moku he va'a he moku, meaning my island is a canoe and my canoe is my island. This saying speaks to the way we are mindful of our place on this earth and how as Indigenous people, we take care of our place because we have a deep pilina relationship to our land and to each other. Another story Inocenta shared with us was how her community in Chuk approached disasters when they would occur, and that was to come together. When a disaster would hit Chuk, everyone would get together and feast, cooking up all the food that would otherwise spoil in refrigerators without electricity, using their ingenious ways of cooking outside to share with everyone. This was also how they checked in on one another. You know, how are you? What do you need? How is so-and-so? And so forth. This coming together of a community is paramount to how we survive in the wake of a disaster. In Hawaii, in our mo'olelo, we learn of the story of our akua, Ku, who, as the mo'olelo goes, fell in love with a common wahine, had keiki, and was living a lovely life as a kanakakane until their community was struck by famine. Unable to bear witness to the suffering of his family and community, he sacrifices himself by diving deep into the aina. Bereaved of her love, his wahine wept over the spot he planted himself to be and watered a sprout that grew into the first ʻulu tree, thus giving life back to the people. Ulu also means to grow, to protect, to propagate, to sprout, to increase. So in looking at the beautiful fruit of ulu, thank you, I created this logo to represent the birthing of our ideas that grew into our foundation. From the bud of the ulu, could you go back to the other side of Kalame? There we go, to that ulu drawing there. From the bud of the ulu, how it's encased in the ieve of the fruit as it pukas out to maturity until ripe enough to pick. We looked at this metaphor as a birthing because it's through the ulu, kumu ulu, that we learned how to address our framework. On the skin of the ulu is a design of divine proportions. Looking at the layers of the skin, you'll see that there are fractals. Fractals are infinitely complex patterns that are self-similar across different scales. And so we realize is the concept of disaster and the different responses we bring to the table, whether that response is a Westernized concept of safety or an Indigenous approach that looks at the layers of cause and effect and finds a solution. In this series, we'll look to ulu, our kumu ulu, as a mentor that teaches us the importance of relationship to land and to each other in addressing disaster response. Moving on to our webinar topics, we over the next few months, we'll cover disaster preparedness, which is today, food security, housing security, school, childcare, and job security, violence prevention, and stress management and social isolation. For today's webinar components, everyone who registers to attend this training will receive an electronic toolkit that includes an infographic, a glossary of terms, topic-related literature, and a ki'i and pule, which Ku'ule, our cultural lead, will define and explain. We will then host a kuka session where community members will offer visceral perspectives on the webinar topic, and Dr. Dana Schultz will lend clinical insight. We'll then host a guest speaker to present, and we'll close out with a discussion.